Professor Chen, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Look, before we get into other issues, can you tell me how the Chinese Peasants and Workers' Democratic Party is connected to the Communist Party of China, or is it not connected?
The Chinese Party, Democratic Party of Peasants and Workers, is an independent party in China. In China, apart from the ruling party, which is the Communist Party of China, there are also a number of other minor parties which are actually providing, policy advices and also, doing social investigations, in the country. In other words, playing their, political roles in the country, to assist the ruling party, to afford their governance.
Our security organisation, ASIO, apparently believes that you are sort of a spy of sorts almost by cancelling your visa. After 30 years working closely with Australia, how devastating was this?
I'm not sure whether they assessed me as a spy, but actually from the notification I received from Home Affairs, I was advised that I have been assessed by the ASIO, by the Australian, intelligence agency as of some sort of a risk to Australia's security. And that, of course, I refuse to accept. I think actually a gross mistake has been made, upon my relationship with Australia. I think this is very wrong. As you said, actually 30 years of, studies of Australia. I really have appreciation and understanding of Australia as a great country, as a great nation with, excellent culture. So on the basis of that, I really think actually this is definitely unfounded. I am not of any risk to any country.
Interesting, 30 years connected to Australia through various prime ministers, Gough Whitlam and Bob Hawke, just to name a couple. So it's taken our intelligence organisation 30 years to decide that you're not what we want. Either the intelligence organisation, the word intelligence, it's an oxymoron, or they're somewhat, or you're the greatest spy ever since James Bond. 30 years, though, that's a long time. They should have vetted you ages ago. And to say that you're not wanted in Australia somewhat seems hysterical, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think actually for me, I'm an academic in Australian studies. I've been studying and researching Australian culture, literary studies, politics, diplomacy, for all these years. I think actually this is actually the right assessment or definition of my relationship with Australia. Throughout the 30 years, as you mentioned, with my connections with Australian, academics, politicians sometimes, but mainly, academics. I think this is a very important link, between our two countries. 50 years of diplomatic relationship between our two countries. We've been working very constructively and productively, towards the development of the bilateral relations to its current status. Before actually the two countries, the relationship have been, deteriorating, but definitely, it has been something that is very, important, that actually our two countries actually are working together for the betterment of, with some kind of, mutual benefits. Well, in politics, in social relations, in economics and trade, and also in culture and education. These are all, mutually beneficial to the two countries, and that's very important.
How would you describe the relationship between Australia and China at the moment?
China and Australia are actually comprehensive strategic partners since 2014. And, since actually the two countries established a relationship with each other in 1972, in December 1972, the two countries have been working very constructively and positively to improve the relationship. That's actually really, not only about, trade relations. Always people talk about China, Australia being, trade partners, but definitely, apart from trade relationship, economic and trade relationship, we have also very, mutually beneficial social relations, political relations, cultural relations, education exchanges, and also even, about military and defense exchanges and cooperation. So I think actually, it is a comprehensive relationship, but definitely our bilateral relations is at an all-time low. this is unprecedented, and this is really disheartening.
It's perceived in Australia and also other parts of the West that China is sort of gearing up for some sort of action. You look at Taiwan, you look at what's happened to Hong Kong, you look at what's happening through the South China Sea, and the list goes on. Tell me this, is there, from your perspective, you're in Shanghai, the general population, what's their thought, or do they have a thought, or do they really care? And two, is it more hysteria and beating of the chest and trying to deflect what's happening domestically within the Western countries?
First of all, when you talk about domestic, Chinese, responses to what is happening, I strongly advise when the travel ban, travel restrictions because of the COVID-19 pandemic eases. If you visit Shanghai, visit Beijing, visit any city in China, you walk out of the hotel, go into the streets, and see what is happening here. This is definitely what is definitely different from what has been portrayed, in the West as a kind of like oppressive, a nervous, country in which the population is being, shut up. This is definitely, not the case, because in China, people have this kind of, understanding of our own country and also the rest of the world. And I think actually there has been a kind of like a smear and scare campaign in the West to portray China as something that is very different. You talk about Taiwan, you talk about Hong Kong. Taiwan and Hong Kong are China's internal affairs. That's not actually international affairs. So actually when China is actually, handling its own affairs, definitely I think actually the West, some media outlets, some politicians have been portraying Hong Kong, Taiwan as something, as if these are something that is external, but that's not right. If actually, China is going to interfere with, some kind of domestic affairs in Australia, definitely Australia will definitely oppose, to that kind of gesture. But, regretfully, I think actually in China, we are actually, seeing a very disappointing scenario in which the West is, simply, interfering with domestic affairs within the country.
Australia is still having problems with the wine trade and other commodities, and we hear that maybe tourism and education may be affected next. China is having issues with some of its investments in Australia. Are things going to get worse for both sides before they get better?
I think actually China obviously is Australia's biggest trade partner, and China values and cherishes its relations with Australia. China is not having any problem with Australia in terms of trade. There's no trade war between China and Australia. Obviously, there might be some disputes concerning dumping, concerning some kind of biological hazard in some of the exports from Australia. But of course, we are dealing with the issues case by case, not as some kind of in Australia some people actually have been portraying China lodging a trade war against Australia. That's certainly not the case. You mentioned about education and also tourism. I agree that actually, definitely, people are having second thoughts about traveling to Australia, even after the international, travel restrictions, being, obviously imposed upon not only China but also elsewhere in the world because of the COVID-19 pandemic. As we can see, actually, in the West, including in Australia, there are some kind of racist, incidents happening around the country, in Melbourne, in Sydney, or elsewhere, even in Perth. There are some kind of racist incidents. I think there's a recent report, carried out in Australia, indicating, a vast, shockingly, big percentage of Chinese Australians, suffering, racist insults or even physical assaults, in Australia. So obviously, Australia is a country that is, that is characterized with very, superb, education, institutions, and also, with sightseeing, sites which is actually quite attractive to Chinese travelers. But obviously, such, incidents are very, daunting, and preventing, the Chinese students and their parents to think about, traveling to Australia to study. But of course, this is definitely something that no parents would actually really have the heart to send their children to a country in which there are always reports, numerous reports about such incidents. So I think actually this is not about, I repeat, this is not about, China imposing a ban on Chinese travelers, on Chinese tourists, or students from traveling to Australia to receive education, to travel. This is not the case. But definitely this is about the actual situation. Any responsible governments would make those, travel advices to its citizens, about thinking, making this kind of right decision of making international travel. And this is simply what is happening in China. And also you talk about investments. I think actually China wants to have investments in Australia, but it is really in the Australian, governments in which there are some kind of restrictive or even discriminatory measures or policies that actually has been preventing, Chinese businesses from, carrying out, normal investment activities in Australia. I have to mention Huawei. There's no evidence to prove that Huawei constitutes any, security, risks to Australia's national security. In the same case, like mine, there's no evidence provided by the Australian side to indicate I could be of any risk to Australia's security. In the same way that actually Huawei, if you mention Huawei, there has never been a single case in which actually the West or in this case, of course, Australia, there has never been a single case in which which could prove that Huawei poses as a risk to Australia's security. But still, this kind of blanket ban has been imposed, and this is really devastating to Chinese investors' confidence in Australia as a country, as a destination that is welcoming, that is open to overseas investments.
Because China and Australia, I recall before COVID, and hated with a vengeance COVID, because it basically messed up our world. It has enlightened other organizations to impose restrictions that are very draconian, resemble a dictatorship, and that's in the West. But the China-Australia, China-West was just moving along just beautifully. Many Australians don't understand why this relationship has deteriorated to this extent. When did things start going wrong, or are considered most damaging from China's perspective?
Well, I remember very, vividly, for example, in 2016, when Malcolm Turnbull was visiting China. He first landed in Shanghai, and he had a big launching. He came to China along with a big delegation, for business and trade. And in Shanghai, he, threw, out a very big, launching party, lunch party, in Shanghai. And I was there, in that big hall, in which actually, there was this feast, and also Malcolm Turnbull spoke very positively of the bilateral relations. He spoke, very optimistically of the future of the bilateral relations, and talk about agility, about, if you remember this word, magic words, agility, about this kind of positivity of the cooperation between the two countries. And 2017 in March, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang visited Australia. He was in Sydney, and he was invited by Malcolm Turnbull to watch football game, an Australian rule football game, in which the Sydney Swans was playing Adelaide Powers, and he was presented the scarves of the two clubs, and he put the two scarves, one red, one blue, on him, and said, actually, I support both teams. I think actually a win-win situation is very important. So actually, by that time, in March 2017, the bilateral relations was still very warm, very, very, very simply, mutually, communicating. There's a lot of humor, a lot of goodwill and warmth, between not only the leaders, political leaders, but also among the people between the two countries. But right in that year, in June, I think actually in Australia there was this kind of a sudden smear campaign on China, talking about Chinese political influence. The media, the Age and also the Sydney Morning Herald and also the ABC, the Four Corners program, started this kind of all-round campaign, on China, talking about Chinese political influence, talking about China trying to, have this kind of infiltration in Australia. Some of the incidents actually, those rumors and stories actually invented were actually later proved to be totally wrong, groundless. But still, this kind of impression that China is something that is of some kind of adverse image had been created. And of course, late that year, 2017, in Australia, this kind of anti-foreign interference, acts have been, passed. Well, it was said actually the law was not against any particular country, but obviously anyone, anyone with common sense will actually easily detect that actually it was aimed at, deterring, restricting Chinese activities and presence in Australia. Okay, that be it. Of course, this is Australia's, internal affairs, and whatever Australia wants to do in its own country. Well, of course, Australia has its sovereign rights. But the next year, 2019, throughout the whole year, this smear and scare campaign has been going on, trying to demonize and stigmatize China. And of course, later we have got this COVID-19 pandemic. We must remember the context. It was actually when Donald Trump was talking about the virus as a China virus, Wuhan virus. And also there are some kind of, hawks, China hawks in the United States, talking about China should be responsible for creating this virus, and also talking about China, should be paying a kind of indemnity, a kind of compensation, to various countries. And it was right at that moment that Australia actually came out instigating, the first, in the world, instigating the international community to have the so-called, independence inquiry on the origin of the virus. I think this is different, because China supports investigation of the origin and also spread of the virus. But at that moment, actually, because Australia has been perceived by China as actually, working, in conjunction with the United States, with Donald Trump, to shift the blame on China, trying to create an image of China as being responsible for the creation of the virus. And that's a different story. That is why actually we're thinking actually whether Australia is really a partner or whether Australia is acting definitely as an enemy of China. That's why actually I think actually in China people, someone like me who has, years, decades of fondness of close friendship with Australia, feels so disappointed, so disheartened. This is not actually a partner or a friend should be doing.
Just, the fear of the unknown. I mean, at the moment in Western countries, it's compliance by fear. If you don't do as you're told, you'll be locked up. Some compare that, though, to China, because you do have a very regimen society. The fear of the unknown is always one of the greatest fears we could have, because we don't know. At the moment, we don't know a whole lot, except that what we're reading in newspapers about China. So that fear of the unknown, which is also fueled by the hysterical press and politicians trying to get their two bobs worth, as we would say, seems to be overruling just common sense. So from your side of things, the fear of the unknown, why doesn't China make itself more open? And I know it's your own country. We shouldn't be talking about other countries doing what they do. We should be looking at our own selves, because Australia, for example, with India, we have a very bad record not bringing Aussies back. America, with what's happening there with compliance by fear, with censorship. So countries need to make themselves more open. Do you think China will ever become an open book, so to speak?
I definitely think actually you're very right in saying that Australia or the rest of the Western world is reading China in accordance with what they have been reading from the newspapers, from the media. that is actually something that has been manipulating the Western, the people's impression or understanding of China. If you turn on the television, if you simply look at what is being talked about China, everything is negative, nothing that is positive. About Chinese control of the pandemic, effective control of the pandemic, about holiday making during the May Day holidays. People everywhere in the country have been celebrating, have been having holidays, enjoying themselves, ourselves. And also, as I said, actually, if you come to China, come to Shanghai, you go into the streets and see people, simply old people dancing, at street corners, young people simply having fun. This kind of, society is not repressive. It's not really something that is as being portrayed overseas. But if you turn on the television in Australia, the ABC or whatever, news items, when China is mentioned, definitely you see those military people, parading streets, clutching, their guns, looking, in a fearsome, manner. But that's not what we are actually experiencing here. China is not militaristic. China is really something that's very, open, mild. I don't think actually China is being closed. People talk about China is closing, draconia, being strictly social control. But definitely, if you come to China, you don't see that. This is actually a kind of society that is very harmonious, that is actually quite at ease with itself. So it is actually, again, this background, actually, people in China like me, reading all Western newspapers, watching Western, television, and see those images. That is this kind of discrepancy. You can't, imagine this kind of, sharp, contrast between the reality and what is being portrayed overseas.
We have in the West, one of the words that are bandied around. It's called racism. I mean, it's very easy to throw that around too, because it's an easy word, and all of a sudden it gets out of control. Then you have some indiscriminate actions happening. But look at the US, it's inherent in all Western societies, and it's basically inherent in all societies. One of the criticisms for China is, of course, your human rights issues. For example, the Uyghurs. From a proud, a Chinese citizen, a proud person of the planet, tell us the reality of these discrepancies and what we hear about your human rights issues, and also with the Uyghurs.
Yeah, in China, definitely, I don't mind. In China, of course, as I said, actually, if you stay in, just for a week or several days in a Chinese city, in a Chinese rural areas also, you won't see, what has been, portrayed overseas as a kind of repressive regime. Human rights issues, violations. Of course, there are crackdowns on criminal activities, theft, some kind of, things like that. But definitely, in China, you don't see, this kind of, oppression. People simply in the university, and also in my university, for example, in the rest of the education, institutions in China, and also in the society, people simply are enjoying their lives. This is simply a very normal, activities of daily life, being carried, out. And also, you talk about Uyghurs, well, I don't know why actually people are actually really believing in what those news stories have been saying, about what is happening in Xinjiang. But the reality over there is definitely, as I said, very different from what is being casted as a kind of very negative, oppressive scenario. Because I've been to Xinjiang myself several times, and during the May Day holidays, my students and also friends, they travel to Xinjiang to have holidays, and you see what they have been posting, on social media. Well, this is definitely not what actually the West have been talking about, about mass arrests, about kind of incarceration. But really, if you look at what is happening, because people actually form an impression of the reality from their day-to-day experience, not from actually some kind of reports that is formulated overseas. So if we look at what we're living in Xinjiang. For example, to Xinjiang, there's no restriction to travel to Xinjiang. Anybody in China can travel to Xinjiang. I myself, and also if you look at my WeChat accounts, they are my students, my friends, traveling to Xinjiang, having holidays just these days, and they took pictures and they post them on their social media. This is really the real Xinjiang they are experiencing. We are experiencing. That's actually what has been really deliberate casting as a kind of demonized scenario.
China's not happy about, back to Australia and Victoria, about the cancellation of the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. But could there have been a different outcome if the Victorian government, which has got a number of faults, they're just stumbling from bad to worse, but if they had consulted more with the federal government, the Australian federal government, on this, and better explained it and its benefits to Victorians?
I don't know what the Victorian government had communicated with the federal government. But as for the BRI, the Belt and Roads Initiative, that's also, once again, I think have been deliberately and craftfully being manipulated in the West as something that is quite sinister. BRI is not about expansionism. BRI is not about invasion, about assertiveness, about aggression, but it is about infrastructure, building. It's about aid programs. It is also about mutually beneficial, projects. So in other words, this is not something that have been created as a kind of Chinese aggression overseas. This is actually the situation we are actually looking at. On the other hand, of course, we are also seeing that actually people in Australia, for example, people talk about the debt trap. So sort of like, by participating in the BRI, countries will be falling into this kind of a debt trap. But, well, of course, Australia is a developed country. And for Australia, how can Australia fall into debt trap with China? This is also, once again, all the judgments, all the assessments have been made, have been formed, on the basis of conjecture, on the basis of something that is lacking in evidence. So that is not the right thing to make, fair judgments. So as for the BRI, I think actually this is, a kind of like a contract between China and also the Victorian government. So in this situation, in this case, actually China is being unfairly treated because contract have been violated. This is totally in violation of the contractual spirits. When you sign a agreement, you keep your promise for the. That is actually, I think, what China has been feeling very disappointed about the violation or about the tearing up of the one-sided tearing up of the agreement between China. Well, in fact, it is between one government agency within the Chinese government and also the Victorian government. So this is not about a national contract, but this is definitely between one agency and also one government, state government in Australia.
What are some of the things that could be done then to bring both sides together? Because that's what is needed at the moment.
Well, I think actually at least people shouldn't be, harboring so much hostility towards each other. This kind of drums of wars are beating. This kind of rhetoric is very terrifying. I think there's no, more, terrifying remarks made about China-Australia relations than such remarks. And also, mind you, of course, we've been reading reports about such kind of, war plan have already been discussed last year, in April last year, in the Australian military circles. So in other words, there are some kind of, preparations or even, plans being made over there in Australia, thinking about engagement in war with China. But this is really very shocking because with such kind of mentality, how could, bilateral relations be improved? I think actually, definitely for the both sides. Of course, there are always, some kind of hawks, within, any country. But if actually such kind of hawkish mentality is taking a kind of like a dominance in the policy making, in decision making. That is really very terrifying. This could be the nightmare of the bilateral relations, or actually even to the stability and peace in the region and also in the world.
All you want is that itchy finger and you've got yourself a massive conflict, which nobody wants because nobody wins. Okay, back to nice things. You studied literature in Australia. You love our literature, obviously. Who's your favourite author? And something that comes to mind that would describe the situation as it is now and to make it better?
For my master's thesis and also PhD dissertation, both papers were on Petra White, the Nobel Prize winner of Australia. I think Australia has got an excellent culture. It has got a literature that is very with nuances, with literary merits, and I've been enjoying reading and also appreciating and also teaching my students about the excellence of the Australian culture and also literature. Apart from Petra White, of course, there are numerous other authors. Right from Charles Harper to Henry Lawson, many other writers, and also the current living authors like Tim Winton, Peter Carey. Those are really what actually Australia should be presenting to the rest of the world, not like some kind of a hawkish image that is actually trying to be provoking, fights, instigating fights with some country like China.
You must be appalled at the level of journalism, not only in Australia but globally. Maybe they could take a leaf out of one of the books and do a spot of learning, as we would say. Look, you're in one of the great cities of the world. They call it the New York of the East. I would most likely say it's better than New York because you haven't got de Blasio, you haven't got Cuomo there. You've got a beautiful city. Professor, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.